Hi, this is Sean Hafer, and in this video, we'll be going over an introduction to Cinema 4D's interface and maneuvering inside of 3D space. So if we look at once we first open Cinema 4D, you've got some options here. These are sort of your different workspaces. So make sure you're on standard. I'm using Cinema 4D 2023.2.1. And we can see I'm on standard. So this way we can all have our icons and everything, our windows in the same spaces. So it's a little easier to follow along. Now there's a couple things I'll talk about before we dive in. The first one is you might notice some of your menu items and your icons might have a little yellow highlight on them. I do not like that. I think it's very distracting for me. What these are features that are new or have changed in the most recent version, and it's really easy to turn those off. If you want to turn those off, just go over to your Edit, Preferences, and then I can come in here and look at my Highlight Features option here, and I can just roll that down and click Off. And so what that'll do, now you can see those are no longer there, and I can close this Preferences window. The next thing I would like to talk about is if you are looking at older tutorials on Cinema 4D versions before this interface upgrade that happened a few versions ago, the majority of the workflow and the way the tools work are all the same. Just newer things have been added in the newer versions, but there was a huge interface shift. So if you are watching an older tutorial, say on YouTube, you can come up here, click on New Layouts, and you can see that now moves that toggle over to the left. Now, nothing changed in our view, but if you go back to the standard menu up here and click on that, now you can see our icons have been moved around. We don't have these over here anymore. Everything's here. We've got some materials down here, and a lot of things are a little bit different. So if you do want to go look at something from an earlier version, just do that. And then until you're comfortable in Cinema 4D, and after you've gotten comfortable enough, you'll be able to sort of know where all those tools are in the new interface. But I would recommend not using this all the time, as this interface will be the interface for all future versions. So I'd recommend, just when you're starting to get started, if you want to switch it over so it's easier to find the buttons and the icons. But once you get a little more comfortable, go ahead and just switch that back to new layouts and utilize this interface. And for all of the videos I'm creating from here on out, I will be using this interface and the way this works. Okay, so let's look at our interface a little bit here. Now, in 3D, we basically have our X, our Y, and our Z coordinates. So if we look at Cinema 4D's viewport here, which is this sort of whole window, we can see we've got an axis. So Y is up, Z is forward and back, and X is to the left and right. You can see there's a little shortcut or a little image of that right here. So if you ever forget, you can always see it in the corner of the window here. And that shows us how we move or scale objects inside of 3D space. So if we want to start moving around in this space, in this view window, let's go ahead and create an object. So I'm just going to click on this cube icon, and it will add a cube to our space here. In this cube, we also see it has now its own little axis lined up with our world axis. And we've got, our Y, our Z, and our X. Now, Cinema 4D is what's called a Y up axis program. That means Y is our up and down direction. Some programs such as Blender, or I believe 3D Studio Max, and maybe AutoCAD will have a Z up. So if you're ever jumping between 3D programs, just look to see what your axis up is. So it just might be a little bit of an adjustment to get used to. But Cinema 4D and After Effects are both Y up. So if you're jumping between those two programs, you shouldn't have any problems there. So once we've created a cube, we can look a little deeper into our interface here. So along the top, we've got some options. This far left icon, this will if you click this, it'll pop out our browser. And this is a little database of materials and models that you can download from the Cinema 4D, the Maxon servers. So these are things, and there's a lot of objects in here and a lot of materials. some scenes if you want to break them apart and see how they did certain things. So that's something that can be very useful. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Over here, we've got where we can lock our axes, X, Y, and Z. We'll get into that a little later. These next few are what we want to edit. So whether we're in points, edges, or polygons, and that's what all 3D objects are basically made of in Cinema 4D, polygons, points, and edges. This next one here is the model. So this will move the entire object around, not just a point or a polygon or an edge. We've got an axis tool, which we'll get into later, some snapping tools, some grid tools, symmetry, etc. These three over here are very important. This is our render settings and render icons. So if we look at this cube right now, we've got our grid underneath it. We see our axes. We wouldn't want to render this out to an image or an animation and have those axes and that grid in there. We just want to see our object. So if we go ahead and click the first one, that's render view or render in the viewport, you'll see now our background goes black. We've got the axes disappear, the grid disappears, and this is just our final output. So that's our render. If you want to see it in another window so that you can save it, for example, you can do the next button over, which is render to picture viewer. So if we look at that, now we can see it created a new window. We've got our image, so I'm just going to scale this out so we can see it and maybe move it up to 100%. It looks a little grainy until we get to 100. And that looks nice and crisp. And from here, we could go ahead and save it as a different image. So as a JPEG or a TIFF or a PNG or whatever we need to do. So that's when you want to output so that you can save it. And the next one is our render settings. And so in our render settings, we can say what size do you want that output to be, resolution, what you're going to save it as if you want it to automatically save, and then a lot of other options that we'll get into a little later. Now, any of these icons that have a little arrow, if you click and hold, you can see there's different options here. So we'll get into these as we move through. But just know that if you see that arrow, you can pull that tab down and see some other possible options. All right. So the next little icon here, sort of tucked away, this is our material manager. So when we start getting into materials, creating different colors and labels and different things to show what our objects are made of, are they reflective, what color are they, etc., we'll use our material manager here. And that one will pop in and pop out just when you hit that. So that's something we'll use here in a bit. Down here, we've got our object tools, things that we can create or things that are modifiers, such as some of these down here. So this is our spline objects. Down below that, we've got our primitive objects, then our text objects. And then here we've got some modifiers, some creation tools, cloners, different things there, and effectors. This last little three here, these are sort of our environmental objects. So for example, here's a sky, a floor. We've got cameras, and then below that, we've got our lights and our light options. And this last one is make editable, which we'll get into in a little bit later in videos. So if you move over here to the right, now the next sort of window is our object manager. So we can see here, since we've got our cube is shown here. And if we want to change that name, say we wanted to call this box, you can double click. Just type in box, and now that's the name there. We can also look at some other options here. So if something is created as a primitive by default, it's parametric, which means it's just being created mathematically. It's not made out of polygons per se yet. And if something is parametric, it'll have that green check mark. And by checking that, you can also make it not visible if you want to do that. It's no longer creating that object. So these two dots next to it are what I like to call the stoplights. The top one is whether or not it is visible in the viewport, and the bottom one is whether or not it renders when you hit render. So if I have both of these as red and I hit render in the viewport, we get nothing. If I keep it red to view it in the viewport, but it's gray or green On the bottom, gray is just default. Green is it will always render. But if I say we just leave it gray and I hit the viewport, it'll render. So you might just want it out of the way because you're adjusting something, but when you do your render, you want it to come back. That's what you could do there. And if we switch those and I make it so we see it in the viewport, but when we render it, it's not there anymore. All right, so if we've got our box, I can select here. I'm in my move tool over here, so I can also select there by just clicking on it. And if we look at our X, Y, Z coordinates here, we can see up is Y, so up and down. Forward and back from us is Z, and side to side is X. There's also a little diagram up here, so if you forget it. So if we wanted to move something along the X, we could always hover over here. So if I'm in my move tool and I've got my box selected, I can just click on that arrow till it turns white and move it that way. If I hit Command or Control Z, I can undo. I could move things on the X, right, by clicking on this one here. I could move things up and down by clicking here on the green arrow. And I'm going to undo here, so we're back in here. And I can also click these sort of multi ones. So this will move it. You can see both of those Y and X turn white, clicking on that little combo arrow, and that'll let us move on those two axes. Those also apply to our sizes down here. So size X, size Y, size Z. So if I've got that selected, down here in the attribute manager, which is the next one we want to look at, we can see we've got size. So I could come in here and I could click and drag. If I wanted to make that skinnier, I could do the size Y and make that smaller. And then we could do size Z and make that longer or shorter. You can also do those manipulations by these little yellow handles, and you can see that will change there. Now, if you want to see where this object is in space, you can also click on this coordinates tab, and that'll show us where it's 0, 0. But if I wanted to move this along the X, I could just click and drag to go positive X, or drag the other way to go negative X. And if I ever want to center things, I can just go ahead and hit 0 and then enter. So I'll click back to object. And if you want to see both of those, you can always just hold down Shift and click both tabs, and that'll show you both things at the same time. All right. Now another way to see those coordinates is down here in the coordinate manager. And that's another little window that's hidden, but we could come in here and see we've got those options. So right here we can see that it's 42 centimeters, and 292.6 blah, blah, blah centimeters, right? So that's all there. And then our last little window over here is sort of a small version of our transport controls for animation, setting keyframes, playback, etc. And we'll go over that in a later video. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave my coordinate manager open down here. It doesn't take up much room. And let's go ahead and look a little bit more about what primitives are and what our views are. So if we're in here now, I'm using my mouse wheel to scroll in. And the way 3D works, or at least Cinema 4D and viewports work, there's a virtual camera that we're looking through. Now we can create cameras and animate those cameras and switch between cameras. But in this video, we're just going to use the default camera. Now, if we wanted to move around that camera, we've got some icons up here in the view window. And so we've got move camera. And if I click and hold that with my mouse, we can move that camera around. We've also got our zoom the camera, right? So we're zooming the camera. We've got orbit the camera or rotate around, right? So we can click and drag that way. And then this last one is a 4-view toggle. So now when you see we hit this is the same perspective view we had. So we're looking at it sort of in 3D space. This is our top view. This is our front view. And this is our right view. So you can see if I move these along the X, you can see how the other views respond. So the top view is ZX. The front view is XY, and the side view here, the right view, is our ZY. so you can kind of see what's going on there. And another way to toggle that, you can either click here, or you can also use your middle mouse button and click in the middle of one of these, and it will jump to that one or to your 4 view. So either this icon or your middle mouse button. So if we wanted to change objects without utilizing sort of these little parameters over here in the attribute manager, we've got our tools over here. So like I said before, we're in our sort of model tool up here, and then we've got our move, which the shortcut is E. We've got rotate, which the shortcut is R, and scale, which the shortcut is T. So I like to think of like transform. So if we come in here and we say, we go to our move or hit E, now we can see we've got our axes here like we had before. Boom, we can move things by clicking in those axes. If we hit rotate, now I'm going to go back to just this perspective view. So I'll click up here. Now you see we've got this gizmo that has little bands. So if I click on, say, the red band and rotate along the X, you can see I can rotate the object that way. If you hold down Shift, it will sort of constrain to 5-degree increments. So you can do that. So now you can see also down here, we can see our rotation is happening here as well. And then if I wanted to go rotate this way, we've got that, right? Then the last one is scale. And scale, when something is parametric, you are not able to scale it other than entirely, because the way that a parametric object is created, it's using mathematics to create it on the fly, and it's all based on its axis or its center point. So if you need to scale something that's parametric, you just do it inside the attribute manager by its properties. So now another thing we can look at is if we look at the basics of, say, this primitive, and I'm going to go ahead and zero this out. So I'm just going to go to my coordinates manager, and on my rotation here, right? So this is our rotation. I'm going to go to 0, 0, 0. I'm just hitting tab and then hit enter. So on the coordinates manager, until you hit enter, it won't do a change. And then I'll jump back to my view here and I'll rotate my view around so I can see that. Now, some other shortcuts for moving around in your viewport would be if I'm here on my hand, right? Left click will give us our move and right click will give our zoom. So you can sort of go that way. So another way we can do this is if we hold down the number 1 and left click and drag, we can move. Number 2, left click and drag, we can zoom or dolly. And number 3, left click and drag, we can orbit. And if you hold down, if you click over the object, hold down 3 and click, that will be the point from where you orbit. So right there, I clicked in the center. You see if I'm back here, it'll orbit around this more back area. So when you're over an object and you click and drag with that 3 held down, depending where you click is where you're orbiting around. Another way to do these manipulations here in the viewport is just holding down your Alt or Option key. So if you hold down Alt Option left, you're going to orbit. Alt Option middle, you're going to move. And Alt or Option right, you're going to zoom. So there's 3 different ways. Now in Cinema 4D, there's a lot of different ways to do a lot of different things. So it's just using what's comfortable with you. And I'll try and mix it up as I'm doing the videos so that you can kind of remember that there are different ways to do it. So now a couple other things. So let's say we were moving around our viewport and we had something, suddenly we're really lost. We don't know where anything is. If you have an object selected and you hit O, that will center it in our view. Now, another thing that could happen is if, say, we've got something, I'm just zooming out and going around, wherever it is, it's over here. You can always come up here also to your view and come into frame geometry, frame default, frame selected elements or objects. So if I do frame default, it'll go back to like as if we just opened Cinema 4D in this viewport view. So before I said this box or this cube is parametric. And what that means is it's generated via mathematics, right? There's no building blocks or segments in it. It's sort of like a vector object versus a object made of pixels or a raster object, right? So there's not really any resolution, for example, in this cube at this point. Now, if we want to see those sort of subdivisions, those polygons or those edges or those points that are our building blocks, we can change our view. So if we go into our display and we come down here to Garode Shading Lines, or you can do the shortcut in and then hit B, we can start to see some edges on here, right? So we've got some options here. Now, if I roll up here, we're not still getting anything with edges, points, or polys necessarily that we can select because it's parametric. But if I'm in my object tool, I've got this selected. Now we can come back over to our attributes manager and look at what we've got. So we've got these things called segments. So if I click and drag this over, so we can see on the X, I've now added 3 segments or subdivisions to this cube. If we could do the same thing on the Y, you can see I've now added 3, 1, 2, 3 on the Y, up and down. And then if we did the Z, the same thing, 1, 2, 3, right? We can see that now we have these subdivisions. So what these are, I had mentioned this make editable icon before. If we hit that or just hit the letter C with an object selected, it will show now a little polygon, a little triangle. And that now means it's editable. So now if we go to points, you can see we can see these points and we can select them. And I just shift selected 2 and I could start moving this. So this is where you could see we could start manipulating things, right? Creating some different shapes. If I go to my edges, I could do the same thing with edges. So maybe I come up here and I grab an edge and shift select another edge and pull that out, right? And then if the last one here would be polygons. And so with polygons, you can grab an entire polygon and just move that up. And this is how you sort of start getting down and breaking down into polygonal modeling. And we'll get into that in later videos, but I just wanted to show that option. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this and we'll jump. Let's do another cube and just break down a couple of its parameters. So if we've got our segments, you can always just type in here too. So if I did 3, tab 3, tab 3, that's going to give us all of our subdivisions. If we make it editable at this point, it's not, but it's okay. And again, if you don't see all your subdivisions, go into Garode Shading Lines or Quick Shading Lines, one of the ones with lines up here into display, and it'll show your lines for you. Now we can see there's a couple things. So we know we've got our scale and like our sizes. So if we wanted to make this 100, now it's, shorter. It's only 100. We also have some things called fillet. And you can see when I click that now, we've got a little rounded edge. So if I render in the viewport, now we've got a little rounded edge, and that's what catches the light and make things a little more realistic. So you can't do this when it's editable, but while it's still parametric, you can. So you could see I could come in here, and if I zoom in on that fillet, you've got how large the fillet is, so 3 centimeters. If I wanted a big rounding, I could do that. But this is where that sort of polygons, pixel versus vector thing comes into play. So if I hit render here, if we look at this edge up here, it's very rough, right? So I'll move it over here using my manipulation tools. And you can see, boom, 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 we've got facets. And we want that to be smooth. That's where the fillet subdivision comes in. So if I click off of it just so I can see those subdivisions. Now if I crank this up a little, depending how close we're going to be, we might want to bring that up to something like maybe 16 and see how that looks. Now we get a really nice curved fillet. So that's where some of these subdivisions come into play. Another example would be, let's get rid of this cube. I'm just going to hit delete. And let's see what else we have. I'm going to click and hold on this icon for my primitives. And let's do a cone. And again, if I've got it selected, hit O, and it'll center it up for me. And let's render in our viewport here. Again, we've got this facet issue. So if we wanted that to look smooth, we would come in here and we could say, just look at our segments on the rotation and crank that out. So maybe we need to go to 64. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, again, it depends on how close we're getting. If I zoom way in and we're going to be flying around this thing, perhaps this close, then that might not be enough. We can start to see it there. So at that point, maybe we go 196 or something, right? And we look at that. Okay, that's smooth enough for that view. So it's always a game of balancing what you need, because this takes up memory, it takes up processing power, the more polygons you have, or the more subdivisions. So you always just want to watch and be careful, and just do what you need. So for this, we can probably go back down to like 64 for this view. Now you can see this has different options here. So we've got, for one thing, we've got a thing called caps. We've got a thing called slice. We've got a top radius. So our top here, so if we needed something like a megaphone or, something like that, and there's our bottom radius, I can make that smaller. We have our height, right? So that's just like in the cube. Instead of XYZ, we've got a height. And then height segments, we've seen that before. Rotation segments we just talked about, but then there's also an orientation. And so right now when this is created, it is created aligned with I'm going to my object tool just to make sure. So it's aligned with our world axis, right? XYZ, XYZ. Now, if we wanted to rotate this, we could come over here and we could hit our rotate tool or hit R and then hold down shift so we can snap to 90 degrees. And that looks good. And if I go to move, well, now our axis is a little wonky, right? So if you knew this was going to be the button for a stereo or something, for example, right? And you might want it to line up so you just know which way to move. It's going to be the same. In that case, instead of rotating it, it's always going to be, and you want it to be sort of born in that position or created in that position, we could go ahead and make that 0 again. I'm just going to hit 0, enter. And this is just like we created it. But I could come in here and go, well, I want to line it up plus X. So this one, you can see it's pointing towards the positive X value. I could do minus X, that'll flip around. I could do plus Y. It's pointing up and down like just it was created. Or I could do minus Y. It's upside down. And then plus Z. So this is the one we'd probably want. So this one, if this was going to be on a stereo, this is the button. We could do plus C, and now we can see our axes still line up on the object with the world. So that's what the orientation for. And it's a really nice tool to use right when you sort of set these objects up. The next one is caps. That's the start and the end caps of our objects. So if we turn that off, we basically just have a hollow object, right? So we can turn that on. We can see cap segments. That's how many subdivisions are in the top and bottom. So you can see as I'm increasing that, we've got segments there. We can also look at the top bevel, right? So we can bevel a top, and we can also bevel a bottom, and here it's called fillet. Some things we'll call it bevel. So if we look now, we've got that smooth edge like we did on the cube, and we hit render, and it catches that light and looks really nice. And we can change that if we wanted the top to be a larger bevel. We could change the radius there and change the height, right? So we could get something very smooth and curvy, like a gumdrop. Right? Or we could bring it up sharper, etc. And those two are independent of each other. We've got our top and our bottom. And then again, just like the bevel on the cube, the fillet segments are how many of those are in there and how smooth it will look. Cool. So you can go through a lot of the different primitives and look at a lot of the options that you can have there. But real quick, I'll just show you the basics of how you would get something out of Cinema. and like the usual workflow I would go through. So I would create my object, and maybe it's this cone. And then I would usually put some materials on it. So I could come over here, click my material object, and then maybe I'm going to double click to create a new material. And by default, it's just showing color. So again, when I select that material over here in our attributes manager, now shows what's here. And I'm just going to grab a color, and we'll get into materials in a later video. So I'll make it a nice little lavender color. And then I can either drag it right on my button or drag it up here, either way. And you can see in the object manager now, we now have what's called a tag that shows us that that's been assigned to it. And maybe I'll create a cube as well. And let's just move that cube over to the side. And we could create a new material. I'm just double clicking, select that one, maybe make it more of a green color, and we'll drag that one on the cube. So if I render that, we've got our two objects. I then might light the scene. So at this point, we don't have any lights. So I'll close this up. So I've got more view, and I would come down here and I'll just click a default light, and we can come and see here now. I can light it with my light. I'm going to go back to my display, road shading lines, and now you can see how that light's affecting things. So maybe I want to come over here, do something like that. All right, if I hit render, now we can see it's lit, but we don't have any shadows. Shadows need to be turned on, so I would turn on shadows in my light. So again, light general, and again, we'll cover lights later, but just to show you a quick workflow, I'll just do soft. Now you can see it's casting a shadow on that cube. And then we would maybe want to render it out. So if I was going to render this out, first I'd go to my render settings, and I would say, let's say I want an output of 1,000 by 1,000. Maybe I'm throwing this on Instagram. And you can see my view adjusted. We've got a darker gray out here, and then this light gray. This is our render area, the light gray area. So I could come in here. That seems fine. Close that. Maybe I want to adjust my camera view a little. So we've got a little different shot. And then I render to picture viewer. All right. So now we've got our object here. We've got our image. And what we could do is now if we wanted to save that, we could go to File, Save Image As, pick whatever you want. So I could pick a JPEG. That's fine. Hit OK. It'll ask where you want to save it. Maybe I'm going to go to my desktop and change the name, test, and then save. All right, and so now that's been saved and that image is there. You can also see any of the previous images you rendered to picture viewer while you still have the same scene open. You could jump between them. So you might do a couple shots and then go back and save them. You can also, in your render settings here, set that where you want to save it. So you can name it and then browse for a slot to save that to. So that's also very easy to do. And the other thing that we would want to do, and I would usually do this first, is save your project. So File, Save As, Save Project As, and then wherever we're going to save that. So again, maybe it's a desktop. So maybe it's test again, and we save it, and now we've got our C4D file saved. All right, well, I hope that was helpful. In the next videos, we'll be getting into more complex modeling and rendering and texturing vibes, but this was just a little intro to get you comfortable with the interface. Thanks for watching.